as part of the EHOD project, we have done a couple of surveys, one of patients and one of the doctors who have been involved in the surveys, involved in the project. And Tara asked if I would present these now, and then Tara's going to do a more detailed results of a more detailed survey of patients after this. So the survey of patients that was done as part of EHOD was organised kindly by Marika, and she distributed the survey both through EHOD itself and through the HCU Network Australia, and also through the National Metabolic Parent Support Groups and a Homocystinuria Facebook community. And we got 22 responses, but actually I think 2 of those were from people from patient organisations rather than actually from patients or carers of patients with homocystinuria. So the breakdown of diagnoses was that about 50% of these patients or families had classical homocystinuria, CBS deficiency, and about 50% of them had a remethylation defect, mostly CBLC disease, but a number also of MTHFR deficiency. And then there were very few others, one patient with a defect of methylation. And as one might expect, most of the patients were children, but there were a number of adults also included in this survey. The survey was completed again, mostly by parents, reflecting the fact that most of the subjects were children, but there were a sizable number of patients themselves, the adult patients, completing the survey. The patients came largely from Australia and the USA, which may reflect the activities of Tara and her group, I think. But we had, as you might also expect, a number of patients from different European countries. The 2 most interesting results, perhaps, of this survey were that most of the people surveyed did not think there was a parent support group within their country. Now, of course, there is only one specific support group for homocystinuria, and that is the HCU Network Australia. But many countries do have parent support groups for metabolic disorders that would cover homocystinuria. But most of the individuals in taking part did not feel that there was a support group within their country or were not aware of it. And then this is perhaps the most striking slide of all, which is that almost all of the people involved in the survey had not been invited to have the patient enrolled into EHOD, which is at first somewhat disappointing when we're hoping that people who are keen, and the fact that they've completed the survey implies that they are keen, would be able to participate in this register. But I think it does reflect partly the countries from where these patients have come, and the EHOD, at least originally, has been a European initiative, so people from the USA and Australia would have a reduced chance of participating, and indeed some of these other European countries, Romania and so on, I'm not sure how many physicians have been enrolling patients within some of those countries. But it is certainly quite striking that the vast majority of these keen families have not actually had the opportunity to enrol the patient into the register. So now we move on to the evaluation by the doctors, and I've actually just, in order to keep things brief, highlighted two of the questions that were asked to the doctors. These were emailed to the clinicians that have been involved in EHOD, and we had 17 responses. And the patients, the two questions I've highlighted, the doctors were asked what they'd found most valuable from the network and register. And what people mostly thought was most valuable was the international networking opportunity. I think that's something that parents often enjoy, but clearly doctors enjoy it too for these rare diseases, because none of us are experts, and we can all learn from collaborating and seeing how it's done elsewhere and harmonising our management. I think the next point is a very telling point, and one that isn't always understood by parents, and so a relevant one to highlight, which is that the doctors found it interesting to discover just how little evidence there was to support current treatment practices. And that's something that I highlight as one of the reasons why we needed the guidelines, to highlight the lack of evidence. A lot of it is just expert opinion without any evidence to support it, and may be wrong. And only by highlighting the lack of evidence can one then stimulate the research to provide better evidence and improve our management. And so that the doctors found very interesting. We obviously, all of us, hope that the register may provide better evidence to evaluate treatment and work out what is the right treatment and what isn't. And doctors also highlighted the importance of considering newborn screening, which may not be perfect, but it is at least an opportunity to improve things for these patients. So that's in terms of what people found most valuable and what the doctors thought would be most useful to continue. And obviously we're not quite sure how much is going to be able to be continued because of the funding for EHOD from the EU coming to an end. But people hoped that we might be able to continue following up this register cohort, because that is how we'll be able to get more evidence as to what treatment works and what doesn't. People, as I've already mentioned, liked the networking, and they felt that continuing to have network meetings would be productive. The guidelines, I hope we will have completed by the end of the project. That doesn't mean to say they couldn't do with being revised in the future, but I think that we will at least have produced that within the time frame of the original project. But people would like us to continue training, and it may be that through the Recordari Rare Diseases programme we'll be able to continue training in the homocystinuria. The other two things are things that haven't been part of the original EHOD project, but that people clearly would like. People feel that perhaps for those centres with less experience in managing these disorders, that some form of telemedicine would be useful. And that some sort of laboratory quality control scheme would also be useful. There are other bodies, I have to say, already doing that sort of thing, and it might be easier for that to be done through those other bodies rather than trying to reinvent the wheel there. So those are the outcomes of those two surveys, and I'll hand over now to Tara to give the more detailed patient survey results.
So as Andrew said, over the last little while we've conducted a patient survey, so asking a couple of questions to do with treatment and information that was available. So we started the survey last year in 2015, and the survey ran for 60 days. We promoted it across our website, our news page, through our members, and also posting on social media. The participation was voluntary, and respondents were not required to disclose their identity. There were 72 respondents. So the demographics of those respondents, so the majority were coming from Australia and continental Europe. The minority of respondents were affected adults, and the majority were coming from caregivers, so mainly parents. There were also responses from the US, the UK, Ireland, Italy and the Netherlands. All respondents were asked the age and type of diagnosis of the affected individual, and as you can see, the responses were mainly coming from caregivers of children aged between 5 and 7 and children under the age of 4 years. The majority of the reported individuals also were CBS. We also asked whether or not newborn screening was available at birth and whether their child was affected. So in order to determine the potential delays and impact on patients, respondents were asked, as I said, to do with newborn screening and whether or not they were initially misdiagnosed, the time it took from presentation of symptoms to diagnosis, and the amount of doctors that they saw to receive their final diagnosis. So 60% of responses came from individuals where newborn screening was not provided at birth. 34% had newborn screening, though of that 34%, only 19 were detected as a result. For many not detected by newborn screening, reaching a correct diagnosis was a long process. On average, it took 4.5 years from the original consultation to obtain a formal diagnosis. 1 in 2 of the reported individuals were misdiagnosed, and the majority, 60% of reported individuals, had seen 3 or more doctors, some seeing significantly more. Further, the majority of respondents reported difficulty in the process of getting a diagnosis. And the majority, delightfully really, the majority, once they had received that diagnosis, they were satisfied with the way that it was communicated. To determine whether or not there is a desire of the patient community for greater information, respondents were asked to rate how useful they would find a range of information, including information on the disorder generally, dietary management, information on betaine, vitamins and formula, and information how to explain the disorder to children. Oh, sorry, I probably didn't clarify that very well, did I? So when we look at, I think, items A and B, so most of the information that patients thought would be useful would be to do with information on research, potential treatments in development and clinical trials, and 1 in 2 respondents rated that information on dietary management would be extremely useful. But generally, I think you can see there's a consistent demand for greater information and education generally in the patient community. Moving on to treatments, so to determine the potential impact of current treatments, participants were asked to report their feelings on a number of questions relating to the specialised formula and diet. 60% of respondents identified that they were on treatment and had varying levels of satisfaction. So you can see that obviously in the displayed chart. Patients also identified to varying degrees arguing with their child about taking formula, difficulties taking the formula, and difficulties eating out or doing something that was unplanned. In terms of diet, as the mainstay of treatment is often diet, we asked respondents how they felt about the dietary restriction. Only 7 respondents identified that it was never hard to follow diet, and the remainder identified varying degrees of difficulty, as can be seen on the displayed graph. 1/4 of respondents felt sad either most of the time or always when diet was restricted. Only 10% of respondents did not find it challenging to weigh or estimate protein in food. Similarly, they identified that it was only 11% identified that it was never time consuming to prepare low protein meals. And the majority wanted to eat things others could eat. And only 42% of them did not have access to low protein foods. Finally, we looked at general patient impacts. So the vast majority of respondents were worried about how the disorder affects them either today or in the future, and 91% expressed difficulty living with the disorder. Many respondents also went on to offer their personal feelings when asked to describe how the disorder affects them or their child. Sadly, the themes again were common and revolved around the personal consequences of living with the disorder, from feelings of anger and embarrassment, deficits in functionality, including behavioural and learning, lack of understanding of the disorder, and social isolation. Moving on from the patients, we more recently surveyed clinicians, and thank you to those who so promptly answered it. We only gave them about a week, I think. Respondents were all collaborating partners with EHOD. It asked a single question to rate whether, in their opinion, specific needs of the homocystinuria community were met. There were 18 respondents. This is a little bit difficult to read, this graph, but 100% of the respondents strongly agreed or agreed that clinical guidelines would be necessary. 68% of respondents strongly agreed or agreed that patients with homocystinuria and related disorders have a need for alternative treatment options. Again, around 60% of respondents strongly agreed that both improved information and awareness is needed within the wider medical community. And around half believed or disagreed that the red flags for diagnosis of homocystinuria are being effectively communicated to the wider medical community. Again, we saw 90% of them strongly agreeing or agreeing that improved information was needed for the patient community. And lastly, 87% strongly agreed or agreed that there is a significant gap in diagnosis. So in summary, as a patient organisation, we feel that the current situation is unacceptable, and generally the 3 points that we see are medical awareness and education is lacking, treatment options are necessary, and information and support for the patient community is desired.